And so anyone who wants to develop their spirituality, anyone that wants to use the services of a spiritualist must know that any spiritualist as imprisoned or only can operate in one tradition is limiting themselves and therefore limiting you if you consult them. And here's why. Because by practicing one, you become an easy target to be undermined, to be sabotaged, and simply to be useless because, you know, you can only fire one bullet from your gun. By having the knowledge of other traditions, you can use other bullets to deal with the blockage, to deal with the forces at play that seek to undermine, ruin, or destroy whatever it is that you're seeking to do for your spiritual benefit. In other words, we use verses from the Quran to make talismans in Ghana and in larger parts of West Africa, whether among the Wolof people, Jollof people, in Senegal, all the way down to Ghana, Nigeria. People use Quranic verses not only for healing purposes, but also for talismanic purposes, for protective purposes, and spiritual purposes. Likewise, people use verses from the Bible for same kinds of purposes. Because what people fail to realize is that the Quran and the Bible, for instance, are not simply religious texts, they're spell books. That is, they're spells that are littered throughout them if you know how to read them. And in future episodes, I'll share with you how to read them in order to not only find, but also to use some of these spells for your spiritual growth and development. But for now, this is what I mean by reading and spirituality, because there's a way in which one has to read, because as I mentioned to you in the previous episode, these parables, these stories, these narratives are coded in metaphysics. So you can't look at them literally and read them and say, oh, that's foolishness. They're parables, right? They're meant to be read a particular way. That is, they're meant to be decoded, right? You can't interpret them literally, right? They have to be decoded. How you decode them? Well, you have to have a particular kind of reflexes or skill set to be able to read across and see what are the common core ideas and features and principles that are at play. And then you'll be able to what? Break down the literal barriers that will lead to, okay, the metaphysical understanding that lays there for us. Here's something else that I'll share with you as well. In reading, what you'll find is that all of these oral and written texts, they provide us with all the clues we need. So for instance, did you know that in a very popular prayer that is used both in the context of venerating Shango in Trinidad, Grenada, Brazil, and other parts of the world, is reciting the Lord's Prayer, which begins with Our Father who art in heaven. Did you know that particular first and second line, there's a misreading of it. So typically in the Lord's Prayer, for instance, it goes something like this: Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Hallowed referring to holy, right? That's the English translation that comes from King James Version. But I want you to read it this way: Our Father who art in heaven, Allah be thy name. Now, I learned this recently, right? I was taught this recently. And this makes a big difference, but I'm going to give you the evidence why it makes more sense than hollow, right? As in holy. You see, the Quran is simply a restatement of the Bible. Many of the characters in the Bible, Noah, Jesus, Abraham, and others, right? Isaac, Jacob, they are all, the Quran simply restates it, essentially repackages it. The Quran, and I don't mean to belittle it, I want to be clear here, right? That the Quran is simply a remix or restatement, simply to say that, hey, you need to listen to the message, right? In the parables and spell book that is referred to as the Bible, right? That's really what it says. It's simply a restatement of the Bible as a way to live a certain kind of code. Of course, seasoned with Arab nationalism, right? That's the context. Arab nationalism is part of the context of the development for the Quran. But you put the national to the side, for the most part, is really a restatement of the Bible. To say that the messages and the lessons and the parables that provide those lessons in the Bible are indeed important, Here's why. So it simply reaffirms and reemphasizes or remixes the Bible, right? And so it makes sense to go back that the statement, as I was taught recently, right, by non-human entities, that it is not simply hallowed be thy name, it's Allah be thy name, right? And so this changes everything in our thinking about the importance and power of reading. So now you have not only two traditions that are merged, that are typically thought of as being different, you also have, right, the names for God that come from these traditions that then acts as what? A powerful source for spiritual growth and development, right? And that's why, as I explained to you in a previous video, I have used, and anyone who knows what they're doing, need to be competent and multilingual, but also multi-traditional. That is, knows several traditions, multiple traditions, to be able to what? Provide the alternative route. So let's say something ritual that you want to go this way and it's blocked. You need to have the means to go that way. Or if something's coming to block you that way, you need to have what? Be able to detour, have a U-turn. But if you're stuck, or if you are grounded, or if you are located within only one particular tradition, then you are an easy and vulnerable individual when it comes to spiritual warfare and spiritual play. And I mean that from years of experiences, but also from how this world works, right? The same way that one should always have a plan B, C, and D, likewise, one should always, as a spiritualist, somebody who is seeking to be more spiritual, is to have what? Multiple ammunitions in your chamber of your weapon, right? You want to be able to have multiple you can lean on. As my grandfather told me once, he says that, right? If you recite or do this ritual in a country or another language, and you do it usually in English, switch it up. Because this way, you're able to what? Outmaneuver, outsmart, and outdo your enemies or those that seek, for you to fail at whatever endeavor that you have designed for yourself or your clients if you're a spiritualist, right? And so, I'll have more for you about the not only importance, but how to practically, right, read to develop and to grow your spirituality and your spiritual development. And I'm sure that many of you are probably wondering, why am I using examples of written texts, the Bible and the Quran in particular, and beyond the obvious fact that these are obviously written texts coming out of tradition that are rooted in those kinds of texts, whereas in many, not all, but in many African societies, the proverbs, parables, and other orally transmitted information are usually passed down generation by word of mouth rather than in scribal written form. And so that is an obvious reason, but here's another reason why. You see, this question has been, bothering me for years, and hopefully you all can help me to, think through it together, wrestle with it. Here's the question. Why is it that many of the African and Pan-African leaders and heroes that we unanimously, venerate or honor, and rightfully so, who themselves were either Christian or Muslim, but at the same time, if we who practice African-based or African-derived spiritualities seem to dismissed the very beliefs that was crucial to those people that we honor as heroes and leaders. In other words, to make this more plain, Marcus Garvey read and used the Bible. In fact, in building the UNIA and Africans Communities League, Marcus Garvey, for those of you unfamiliar, was a Jamaica national who migrated to the United States, to Harlem in particular, and who started what became known as the Garvey movement, the largest mass movement among African descended peoples in the modern world. And so Garvey himself had used the Bible liberally, and in fact came out of a Anglican Christian background. Malcolm X, whom I love and whom received the name Omowale while he was in tour in Nigeria in the 1960s. He was a Muslim, and not only a Muslim, but a minister, right? Harriet Tubman was a Christian. Kwame Nkrumah was a Catholic, right? And we can go down the line. Anyone that is a national Pan-African leader or hero of sorts has this particular trademark. Not all, but the vast majority do. And my question to myself, because this has been a curiosity to me, and it might be curious to you, is why do we celebrate those individuals but cast aspersions on their beliefs and faith that made them who they were, right? Because if you think about it, I think they were onto something that we have failed to realize. And here's the thing. Of course, it makes sense that things are presented to us as white or white supremacists, that is the blonde hair, blue eye Jesus, or the angel with white wings and flying around, and the Christmas and the Santas. Of course, many of us who reject those iconographies, those symbols, and reject the ideology that drives them, rightfully so, often I think miss a very subtle point, is that why did our deep and recent ancestors, who we recognize as heroes, who we recognize as champion for African descended peoples' liberation and freedom, but at the same time, we want nothing to do with the very bedrock of their faith and their belief, right? I don't mean adopt it or accept it, but at least to engage with it, right? And there are some of us who might even entertain, being a Muslim, particularly those who get incarcerated and are introduced to a form of Islam via the Nation of Islam or, the 5%ers or others, but then throw everything out when it comes to Christianity. Remember, as I said to you before, Christianity has nothing to do with God. Christians are simply a group of people that claim God, but doesn't mean that they actually know God or represent God, because God belongs to no one religion or particular religion. God lives within us. It belongs to every human being that exists on this earth, right? Every real human being exists on earth, because there are, of course, negative spirits and forces that assume human form. And so not every human is actually of God, right? Though it may come originally or at some point from God. And so it's a very important question that I want to put out to you all, not only to get your thoughts and feedback, but also it's very important to how we read, because many of us who take a position one way or the other, either for or against, or had nothing to do with Christianity and Islam, or therefore the Bible and the Quran, for instance, still are pouring libation to Malcolm and to Marcus Garvey and to Harriet Tubman and to others, but you're also pouring libation to the spirit of the people who are rooted in those traditions, right? Which means you're also honoring those traditions. And so there's a contradiction there, right? There's a sense of perhaps hypocrisy there, right? And I think the hypocrisy can actually die down if we read closely, because if you read closely, you'll see that the only way to understand the Bible, I want you to hear me here closely, the only way to understand the Bible is to read it through African history. That's the only way you'll get it, right? The only way to understand the Torah, which are the books of Moses, right? That constitute the first, the Old Testament, but most of the books of Moses. The only way to understand that, and therefore understand groups that have been Jews, African Jews for centuries, right? Which are the philosophers who are people living in Ethiopia. These are African peoples who have been Jews for a long time, right? For centuries. Only way to understand them, and therefore Judaism, is to read it through African history. The only way to understand Islam before it was born, when it was just simply a concept, right? It was simply in sort of stillborn form, right? When these early Muslims were chased out of Mecca, they had safe haven in Ethiopia. And so in Ethiopia, it begins to crystallize before it returns to Mecca from Medina and becomes what it became. And so The only way to understand these so-called world religions is through African history, but that comes from reading both African history, both those individual religions or traditions, and of course the African traditions that what surround or envelop, those textual faith with the orally supplied, traditions in the form of parables, stories, narratives, and proverbs that have been transmitted over the generations, that are not pristine, that are not unchanged, because the point is not the actual literal exactness. The point is the message. The point is the lesson. And that's the takeaway for the patakis. That's the takeaway for the parables in the Bible. That's the takeaway for the verses or surahs in the Quran. That's the takeaway for the oral narratives, whether they be Anansi stories or they be other kinds of orally transmitted narratives. That's the takeaway for, other kinds of traditions of an African origin in terms of spirituality and spiritual culture. Is what's the lesson? What's the takeaway? And ultimately, that is what is meant by God's word, the original speech or utterance that brought, right, shape and life to form, that allowed for animal, plants, and humans, that allowed for existence, is the word. And the word is in those principles, in those takeaways, in those lessons, in those parables. So whether you call them the divine principles of Ma'at, whether you call them the Hammurabi Code in ancient Babylonia 1,000 years later, whether you call them commandments, whatever you call them, those are the bedrock that have been issued to us over the centuries to remind us of what it means to, be one from soul to soul with our Creator, with our Maker, with the Almighty. And because we are, as a humanity, not there yet, we need these reminders through these traditions. And therefore, by reading closely, by reading across traditions, it strengthens your own, it enhances your own, and leads to your growth and development. Ultimately, your soul to be one with God. And therefore, when it's time to go home, you can go home. For Baba Nyame, I've been your guide and host. Till next time, stay well. Drop your question in the comments below.